I'm Roz Bulleid, Deputy Policy Director at Green Alliance, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. This webinar forms part of our Cutting Carbon Now work, which is generously funded by the Network for Social Change. It follows on from two previous webinars covering climate change and COVID-19 and nature and the green recovery. You can find recordings of both of those on our YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be looking at one of the parts of the economy and our daily lives most affected by the current crisis. The impacts on transport have been profound. Car use in the tightest period of lockdown was down to 1955 levels, and planes are still a relatively rare sight in the skies above us. Travel on buses and trains has been actively discouraged at times. People have noticed the quieter atmosphere and cleaner air that this great pause, as some are calling it, has brought. You might have seen the survey from the AA this week that suggested half of drivers would walk more and 40% drive less in the future. However, many observers fear that without a really concerted effort, we'll see commuters and families concerned about the safety of public transport opting for cars instead. Will new cyclists stick with it if we return to clogged roads and poor air quality? Do we need to do more to get on track to a net zero aligned transport system? Joining me to discuss all of this are three leading figures in the world of sustainable transport. Chris Boardman is a passionate advocate of cycling with an Olympic gold medal and numerous other sporting accolades to his name. He's now Cycling and Walking Commissioner for Greater Manchester, running a £1.5 billion 10-year programme aimed at providing attractive alternatives to car use. Shirley Rodrigues is Deputy Mayor for Energy Environment at the Greater London Authority, working with Transport for London to deliver the Mayor's plans for tackling air quality and net zero across London, including expanding the ultra-low emission zone and creating low emission bus zones. Jillian Anable is a Professor and Chair in Transport and Energy at the Institute for Transport Studies, University of Leeds. She has a fascinating range of interests, including future mobility systems, understanding travel behaviour, and the intersections between transport, energy and climate policy. Before I hand over to the panellists, a few bit of housekeeping rules and engagement from me for all of the audience members. First of all, if you hover your mouse below where you can see my face, you should be able to see two buttons, one for the Q&A and one for the chat. This chat is where you can discuss ideas amongst yourselves and respond to things that panellists say. This is meant to stand in for our usual drinks and social networking session after Green Alliance events. We've also got the Q&A section though too, and this is where we'd like you to post any questions you have for the panellists. If you go there, you can also upvote individual questions with using the thumbs up button beneath each of them. Please do this, as it'll be enormously helpful for Emma Pollitt, who's our policy assistant, and who'll be collating the questions with ones that we've also received before the session and passing them back to the speakers later. I'm also joined in the background by our events manager, Ollie, who I'm sure will be able to handle any technical glitches. Hopefully that all sounds straightforward. I don't want to keep you from our speakers any longer. I'm going to hand over to Chris Boardman, who will tell us about some of the work Manchester is doing to avoid a rebound in car use as lockdown restrictions begin to be lifted, and what more governments could do to support mayors and local authorities in these kinds of actions. Chris, over to you.
Hello. Right, where to start? Because it's very interlaced, past, present and future. So what I thought I'd do is sort of batter through a brief history to bring us up to speed, if that's okay. I think really there's three phases for what we're talking about here. It's getting people to actually want to change, which is my bit of the job. Letting people see how it's possible, if you like, politicians, councillors and officers, to create the belief that it's actually doable in a language that they speak or that they choose. And then, of course, there's how to change. And that bit's down to getting to inspiring engineers. And I've teamed up with one in particular who did a lot of work in London, Brian Deegan, who's part used car salesman, part engineer. And he's been absolutely brilliant. So as was already mentioned, I've been a campaigner, I'm not quite sure what title to put on it, for active travel for several years. Happened back in 2012, really, when I found myself on Newsnight talking specifically about the Olympics, but then they went on to cyclists needing registration and why doesn't everybody wear a helmet and all that kind of stuff. And I was amazed and slightly angered by the level of ignorance in the questions, and it became a passion. So I worked with British Cycling for several years, really seeing what we could do to leverage it. We made some progress with the government, and we saw the institution of a national cycling strategy went to the statute books. It was required. That was a big step forward. And then, of course, we stalled, and we found that there wasn't actually a plan that married up with the ambition, and we stalled. But then, nevertheless, we made some progress. And then we decided to work regionally, in essence, to try and create an example at such a scale, it was unignorable. Because people had got used to the fact that London was doing something, and they were the first to announce £1 billion, and yes, that's the capital, and it just wasn't getting the traction necessary with the rest of the country. Andy Burnham had just become mayor of Greater Manchester, and one of the people working with me used to work with him at DCMS, rang him up and said, you should have a cycling commissioner, and it should be him. So Andy phoned me up and asked me if I'd do the job, and I spoke to Andrew Gilligan, who was Boris's cycling commissioner, and said, what do we need? And he said, you've got to have control of the cash in some way, and you must be speaking for him. So I went back to Andy and said, we need some form of control of the finances to have some leverage, and it needs to be speaking for you. And without hesitation, he said, yep. And then I thought, oh shit, I'm going to have to do it now. So that's how I found myself in the role that I'm in now. And it was fascinating. I spent 3 years going and exploring 3 months exploring how people were doing things, why they were doing it. I found out that there was over 2 million car journeys every year in Greater Manchester of less than a kilometre. And I found out that people actually wanted to change. And that's when I bumped into Brian Deegan, who I mentioned at the start. And he is a can-do person who looks at a problem and said, we can get around it this way. He doesn't look at a problem and says, oh, we can't go forward. Quite rare amongst engineers, I would suggest, still quite a rare breed, but perfect for people who actually want to introduce culture change. And we went to the councils, all 10 districts of Greater Manchester. We gave them a pen, figuratively and literally, and said, show us where you wouldn't go with if you were a parent pushing a double buggy, which became our de facto walking standard. Where wouldn't you let a 12-year-old go, a competent 12-year-old, where wouldn't you let them ride a bike, which is the proxy for people popping to the shops, hadn't ridden since childhood, I'm a little bit wobbly, etc., etc. So they were our two standards, and the councillors drew on the map, and they drew the big main roads, and then we said, right, well, what about all the other ones you haven't marked? Are they quiet? Yeah, they're quiet. Well, would you ride your bike there? Yeah. Well, why don't you? Well, I come to the end and I get to this road. Okay, what about if we got you across that? Okay, so mark that as a crossing. What about the next one? And within an hour and a half, they looked at the map, and for each of the 10 districts, there was a moment when they looked at it and thought, this is possible. And the belief was there. So we within a space of weeks, we had a draft for the whole city region, and the councillors, the leaders of Greater Manchester, 10 of them, had the courage to say, yes, we'll put it online as a draft. We won't spend hundreds of thousands with consultants, work it all up, 2 years later, then go and try and sell it to people. We'll just show people the draft and let them comment. Just within days, we had more than 4,000 comments, and our biggest complaint was, where's ours? So that was something that we learned that was just a great way to get buy-in and to give councils the confidence to do something different. At the same time, we got some cash. We got Transforming Cities Fund, more political will, where we had 160 million ring-fenced by Mayor Andy Burnham and the leaders specifically for this. And we had standards attached to how that money was spent. So right up to date now, we have 84 schemes on the books worth more than 200 million. And we're well on the way. But it does take time. As London found, it takes time to mobilise and get the people who can actually deliver this stuff. So that's where we were a couple of months ago. And then we bumped into a crisis, and that reframed everything. And we didn't know for a while which way it's going to go. We don't know what's going to happen with transport. A lot of us, I think we realised just how much influence locally that the national government has when they make a pronouncement and say, this needs to be part of your recovery strategy. It changes everything. And we could see that, I really try hard not to use the word opportunity, because thousands of people are dying, but we also can't ignore the fact that the environment's changed, people like it, and there's large elements of it that we want to hang on to. And so we're in the process now of looking at how we do that and how we do it quickly. And it's not easy. It puts a huge amount of stress on officers And we're seeing different priorities butting up against each other. So yes, I can make a protected cycle lane, but what am I doing about the bus? And if I make the pavement wider, where am I going to get that space from? I've got to go out into the road, which is across an existing bike lane. Haven't got room for both. And it's forced upon us the realization that we have to choose. We have to choose how we use this space. So I think to round up, the beauty of where we are now is the temporary nature of it, because you can try, you have a specific, this is about the virus, this isn't about the future, this is about keeping people apart, letting them travel without using public transport, because there is such a small amount of them that are able to do that. We have a huge body of evidence in the last 2 months that said people will do this. You've given them nice weather, yeah, they're bored, they need something to do, they can't use public transport, all different reasons, but the fact is a huge percentage of people decided to ride bikes. On average, we're 42% up on pre-COVID levels, when every other mode of transport is between 60 and 90% down. And by doing it with temporary measures, you can address the needs of the virus, you can try something different, and if it doesn't work, you can take the cones out and go back to normal. And really the question for us is, if we don't try, what does that say about us? If we don't even give it a go? And I think that for me is the driver right now. And many of the people I think who are on this call are in a position where, and it may sound melodramatic, but they can change the country for the better or not. And I genuinely believe that what happens in the next 20 days will set the agenda for the next 20 years. I think that's enough from me.
Thanks, Chris. That's really inspiring stuff. Hopefully everyone out there is motivated and get on with things. Perhaps, I don't know whether you feel that Manchester's in a particularly strong position here and have got resources that some other councils wouldn't have. Is there more that you would ask central government to do to support those councils and people working there who might have slightly less resource or more challenging situation?
Well, slight technical correction here, just to be pedantic. Greater Manchester. Manchester's one of 10 districts, and they're all different, and they all want to tackle the challenges that we have now in different ways. We have got some alignment, but it's not without its challenges, and particularly places that have relied heavily on the car, which Manchester itself has, to change is particularly difficult for them. As far as cash goes, I've never believed, cash is an indication of political will. And what we're talking about now is planters and paint and cones. It's cheap. We have new powers to go with powers that we already had, which are frankly good enough. We've had those strengthened slightly with emergency powers. There's emergency funding, certainly for the major places. And the methods that you want to use in the first instance can be really cheap. This one is about changing how you use space. And that's what it's always been about. But right now you have a chance to try it. I think if cash was all the problem, I think we'd have solved it a long time ago.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Shirley now to talk about London's approach to walking and cycling and retaining the improvements in air quality Londoners have noticed during the crisis. And Shirley, also apologies for mangling your title along with Manchester and Greater Manchester earlier.
No worries. And thanks, Roz, and thanks to Green Alliance for inviting me to talk a little bit about London. And it's great to follow Chris, who I met for the first time today, and hearing about what your approach, which isn't hugely dissimilar from what we're taking in London. Will Norman, who's our Walking and Cycling Commissioner, but obviously Heidi Alexander, who's Deputy Mayor of Transport, and I, we're all working on this in different aspects, but basically it's about making London a better place to live. And I think one of the things that we've been really clear about, Sadiq has been really clear about, is we want to build back better. We can't return to business as usual, and that's from a whole host of reasons, but primarily from our air quality problem we're facing in London, but also for tackling the climate emergency, for health impacts, for the economy, and so on. And as Chris has pointed out, we've already seen massive changes for the good. And we want our recovery to be a green recovery. So that means, really implementing some of those emergency measures, and then I think really trying to make sure that those become more permanent. So the first thing you may have heard about is the new street space programme, which is really about how do we reclaim some of London's road space to enable more walking and cycling, so that people who are not able to use public transport, and we don't want to encourage people going back to the cars, that are able to leave that capacity on the tube network and the train network for those people. And we're also, in terms of our green recovery, the Mayor, with our local authorities, London councils, announced a new board, which is our recovery task force, which will be overseeing the implementation of London's recovery from the pandemic, and in particular really focusing on our economic and social recovery, making sure that it's a fairer, cleaner, greener recovery, and that one that makes London more resilient to future shocks as well. So in terms of transportation, the challenge we face is the capacity, and Chris has alluded to what's happening in Greater Manchester, but in London, our network it means that the capacity for our public transport network is going to be reduced to a fifth of pre-crisis levels. So that means we need about 8 million journeys a day needing to be made by other means. And similarly, many of those are quite short distances. Ones that could probably be done on a bike in about 10 minutes. So how do we get people to think about and to move to those to that active form of transportation? And the other thing for us is we had been implementing a number of measures, from congestion charge, the ultra low emission zone, low emission zone, which had seen a huge decrease in our air pollution, something in the order of nearly 50%, around 44% of nitrogen dioxide in the central London ULEZ zone. That's a massive change, and it really does dwarf actually the change that we've seen since COVID and the lockdown, and the sort of number of cars that have dropped, not been driving around. So what we're worried about is as people start to go back to work, and as lockdown eases, we're already seeing people saying that they would probably want to drive instead of use public transport, and we don't want the erosion of the benefits and the impacts that we've managed to secure. And we've done some reports there on our website. But just before lockdown, we had seen something in the order of 44,000 fewer polluting vehicles in the central London ULEZ zone. And the ones that were still there, most of them were compliant vehicles with the Euro 6 diesel standard. So COVID brought extra reductions, and we'll probably see some of those eroded. But what can we do through this process to keep those gains? And we know walking and cycling are absolutely essential to our recovery as people go back to their cars, let alone all the other disbenefits from noise, pollution, safety, and so on. So as an emergency measure, like many other cities, we've been introducing fast-track changes to reclaim road space with planters, with cones, and then sort of, very fast pavement works and so on. And that's been building on the work that Heidi Sadiq have been doing in terms of the sort of record investment we've put in London in walking and cycling. And that's seen a tripling of the protected space. They're not all dedicated cycle lanes, but there's protected space for cycling under Sadiq. And those measures that we're proposing in the street space, the things like a cycle lane down Park Lane, and looking at some of those measures in some of our town centres like Brixton and Camden and so on, we're expecting to see a 10-fold increase in cycling and a 5-fold increase in walking if we can manage to get people to use those new measures. And we're also encouraging people to use the Santander bikes, the free hire bikes, NHS staff, care workers and so on. We've seen more than 10,000 free hires since the scheme was introduced in March. But we are starting to see car journeys start to tick up. And because of that, we've reintroduced the congestion charge, the ultra low emission and low emission zone. You may have seen some controversy about that in the papers. We're going ahead with the new low emission zone standards that in October, although enforcement will be postponed temporarily for 4 months. And Sadiq, when he reintroduced them, or when he suspended them, was actually really clear. This was not an invitation for people to go back, to get into their cars, because we really believe that the recovery of our city really does need us coming out of our cars. And I think what's been brilliant, and again Chris talked about it, is that people are rediscovering things that that they hadn't thought about, like walking and cycling again as a way of getting around, and not just exercise, but also it's a sort of social activity as well, and it's quick and cheap to do. But what we want to make sure is that we lock in those temporary measures that we have now so they become more permanent. And we've done lots of things, and I know other cities have done this, where we've done car-free days to help people reimagine what this looks like. Well, we've got that experiment out there now, and we can see what it's like. So let's try and keep those gains, as I've mentioned before. We're looking to work with our schools to expand school streets, so that, especially so that allows children, when they do go back to school, to do so safely. And we're asking government for more help. You know, money does help. We don't have enough money to do all of these things, so I think we're absolutely calling on government to help fund some of these changes, and particular for people who want to get rid of their cars. You know, a scrappage scheme that would help people move on to cleaner, you know, forms of transportation, or we were talking about how that might help people go into public transport as well. And the thing that I'd want to end in, you know, is government to really send the signal. We have an environment bill going through Parliament at the moment. It's sort of been paused a couple of times, but we and many other Metro mayors, Andy Murdham as well, have been calling for the WHO standards to be on the face of the bill. That is such an important signal to be sending, along with all the other signals around climate emergency and a green recovery. But that would be a really good thing to send to people about the importance of really the measures that we're taking, which will help improve our air quality, reduce health disadvantages to people, and tackle the climate emergency. So I think I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thanks, Shirley. One thing that's struck me a little bit is that we've heard much more about key workers and the situation that they're in, and much more prioritisation perhaps of their role. I wondered whether you've kind of thought about equity concerns and how to get everyone involved in some of this change in transport. Making, for instance, old vehicles tend to be owned by lower income families, and also maybe smaller houses might not have bike space. Is that sort of concerns about sort of equal opportunities for everyone to access this kind of new means of travel? Is that something you factored in at all?
It's absolutely critical. You know, I mentioned before the recovery task force. You know, what it's about is not just the economic recovery, it's about social justice, and recognising that the impacts of pollution or people's access really does fall unequally on people. And we've seen that in terms of the death rate and the sort of people who are falling ill from COVID. But before that, we've done lots of research in London that showed that air pollution really fell hardest on the lowest incomes and on the BAME community, who are least likely to own the cars and to cause the problem. So we have been implementing, Sadiq has brought in things, he's been lobbying very hard for government to help with scrappage schemes, both for low income and disabled people, but also for our businesses, particularly small businesses and charities. We've been lobbying away, so he's been able to carve out a little bit of money before obviously the situation we're in, where our fare income has tanked for Transport for London, to support those scrappage schemes. But we continue to lobby very hard for government to think about this as part of the green recovery. And when they start thinking about stimulus packages, as they are doing now, they should be thinking about how they can direct that to the most vulnerable and those most in need, to address those equity issues, but also to make sure that, as I said, we build back better, that we don't support polluting industries, that we try and get them to move faster into you know, meeting our net zero target. In London it's a 2030 target, but you know, the UK 2050 target, and so on.
Great, thanks very much. Now I'd like to invite Jillian to give us an academic perspective on the situation we find ourselves in now, if that's all right, and drawing on your background in behaviour as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, I'm sitting here. I am feeling slightly nervous actually, and that's because I know that I'm not going to give as positive a view as previous two speakers, and in a way that's because I've decided not to. I've decided to play devil's advocate in a way and put the other side. But I saw the kind of remit, if you like, for this as me drawing on my expertise in understanding mobility behaviour, what role mobility plays in people's lives, what we think we may have known about that before COVID, about what shapes mobility patterns for people, and the sorts of things we can or needed to do if we really were going to think about radical change. Then thinking about what actually happened in COVID-19 and during this crisis, and whether or not does that throw out of the window everything that we knew before, because suddenly we've had this massive scale of change, the speed and the scale, the likes of which we have been saying, policymakers have been saying we could never achieve things at that speed before. So are the things that we think we knew about how behaviour changes now still things that we need to bear in mind as we try and grasp the opportunities that we've just been speaking about? To give you my, if you like, my headline conclusion, or the nugget which sums up, if you like, where I'm coming from, I think it's perfectly plausible and in my view actually probable that both walking and cycling and car use are going to increase, and particularly car use over the sort of medium term as we climb out of any kind of recession that we have. I'm not entirely positive about the role of walking and cycling, and that's because I do think we have to bear in mind the scale of the change that we need to make happen for reaching our climate targets. And walking and cycling before COVID-19 in the UK accounted for around 4% of the distance that we travel. That's not including aviation, so the surface passenger distance that we travel. So cycling about 1% of distance, walking about 3% of distance. To put that in perspective, somewhere like the Netherlands, where we say, oh, let's go Dutch, they've got it right in the Netherlands, cycling there accounts for about 8% of distance travelled. So we think if we can just get to Dutch levels, we'll be okay. But the carbon footprint of the per capita carbon footprint of Dutch people based on their travelling, and again not including aviation, is as large as ours in the UK, even though they do so much more of their travelling by sustainable active modes. And the reason for that is that they love their cars and they get in them and they go quite long distances in them. And you could say, well, you know, they've got longer distances to travel, they're not on an island. But one of the things that worries me about this particular transition that we're going through at the moment is that we can, on the one hand, celebrate the reduction in air travel and think about the fact that that probably will take a long time to bounce back. But that leisure travel has to go somewhere. And at the moment, we focus a lot on the proportion of journeys that are short and that can be walked and cycled. But the statistic we really need to focus on, that will really get us to where we need to go from the climate point of view, is that 3% of trips that we undertake are responsible for 1/3 of the distance that we travel. That's, again, not including aviation. Okay? And those are predominantly leisure journeys with some business travel thrown into the mix. So we reduce aviation. We try and satisfy some of that leisure travel in the UK as domestic travel instead. We already know that if we were to replicate current patterns of leisure travel, that this involves very, very long distance journeys and are some of the hardest to tackle by any other means, because they are family journeys, car occupancy is quite high, and the stuff you take with you is quite high, and the freedom that the car brings is all part of why the car is attractive for that journey. So if we're going to think about walking and cycling as really making a proper difference to carbon, and it really would have to go some to do so, the only real way that we can, the way that we must start to talk about that is not just in terms of smaller, sort of small areas within city centres and short distances, but we must do two things. One, we must talk in conjunction with mode shift about destination shifting. We have to move some of the medium and longer distance journeys to be more local. And that's including leisure. What can we do to make leisure attractive locally? But also including putting back services into areas that have lost them of all kinds. Thinking about the concepts such as they're using in Paris, but could be used just about anywhere in our planning, of the 15-minute city. What do you have to have within 15 minutes of walking and cycling distance of you to make a sustainable place? So that's about planning and destination shifting, rather than just narrow kind of let's widen pavements and put the cycle paths into the sort of most urban parts of the places. The second thing, so that's destination shifting. The second thing is we have to start to change our mindset about cycling being only for short journeys. And this is about e-bikes and e-mobility, which I believe could be the real revolution in terms of sustainable mobility, because of the distance horizons that they change, because of the fact that they could attract people onto cycling that are not so attracted to conventional cycling. But that in itself is not just a drop it in and it will do some good. It also involves planning, and it involves infrastructure and investment. And it involves thinking about the sorts of journeys that are done, including in places like Greater Manchester and London, where actually when you take the greater part of Manchester and London, still more trips are done by car than any other mode. And really thinking about where those sort of medium length trips are really going to and from, because often they're not straight into the city centre, but they're round and about, and they're joining up sub centres and places a little bit further out. So that's about a real change in mindset, because I'm actually really concerned about the real positivity that's going on about walking and cycling, and suddenly everybody wants to do it, but we're actually not using that to change our mindset as to what we really think needs to happen to cement that into a proper change. And that is about thinking about destination shifting and the fact that these don't have to be for really shorter journeys. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thanks for some good provocative thoughts there, Jillian. We'll allow the other speakers to come back on some of those later, and they can respond during the questions as well. I think just on the destination shift, I think it'd be really interesting to see the impact of people home working and how long that can be continued, and what role that plays. And sort of perhaps if people are working from home, it'd be really interesting to see if they might be prepared to spend more time closer to home generally as well.
That's right.
I was just going to ask about the role of public transport, actually, because you didn't mention that much, and whether you think public trust can be rebuilt there, and how it fits with what you were saying.
Yeah, so we've also got to be in no uncertain terms that public transport was suffering as a financial proposition before COVID, and certainly bus travel was also suffering in terms of its popularity and patronage in a lot of places around the country. So clearly COVID is potentially a death knell for some aspects of it. I think this is where there's a huge amount of danger. So with respect to train travel, a lot of train travel is local, but with respect to the longer distance journeys, which I really, really think are the key to the climate problem, if we're going to actually get the transport system to contribute to any part of our climate objectives, then we have to tackle the long distance journeys that no one is doing, no one. Then the train system is absolutely key, and we were at capacity before, so I think this is why I'm really very pessimistic, but I think we are, for many longer distance journeys, going to see a switch over to the car, and those journeys are going to be very difficult to compensate for, with walking and cycling. Just very difficult, because they're just the nature of those journeys, and they're actually going to sort of swamp some of the replacement by walking and cycling of some of the bus journeys that we might be able to do. So that's why I'm really quite pessimistic.
Okay, well, maybe we'll go to Emma now and see what questions she's getting from the panelists, rather, from the audience, and see if we can find something to make Jillian a bit more optimistic amongst those.
Thanks, Roz. Yeah, we've had a lot of questions through the Q&A box, so thanks everyone for that. We've had a lot of questions about behaviour change and how we can really lock in the existing changes that have happened throughout COVID. So I know Shirley touched on that a bit, and I think it's part of all of the Palace intro, but I was wondering if people could expand on that.
Should we start with Chris and Shirley, and then quickly on this one?
On behaviour change, well, I think I mentioned it at the start that language is everything. In fact, the majority of this job is communication, because if you took anybody from the UK and took them somewhere where there's low car usage, and I mean, we keep using it, and I tend not to really, people get sick of it, the Netherlands and Denmark, but if you put them in Utrecht and said, which do you prefer, this or where you live? Most people would go, actually, this is really nice. I'd be happy to let my kids ride and walk about here. I prefer this. So we don't have a problem with the destination. It's letting people see how they can attain that. And that's why when I mentioned at the start, having a double test must be usable and want to be used by a parent with a double buggy. People understand that. It's something that they can visualise, and it's something that they would value. But what that actually means in terms of standards are incredibly strong. You can't just have a nice wide pavement and space to push a double buggy, and then you've got to deal with a really difficult road, and then because you won't use any of it because of the difficult road, you've got to do all of it. And the same for a competent 12-year-old. If you build for must be usable and want to be used by a competent 12-year-old, and their parents would let them, it's nice and simple. I get it. All the leaders of Greater Manchester got it and said, yeah, we'll sign up to that. It's almost a benign trap, to be honest, because then you go, what does that actually mean? And giving people a choice, I think that was really, really important. One of the first things I said in initial meetings was, listen, if you don't want to do this, let's not do it. Let's not do it at all. But we're not paying to do it badly. And then it was a proper choice. It was a proper grown-up choice. And then you started to talk about, oh, no, we do want to do it. Okay, well, what's in your way and how do we get around it? And I think for me, I had to be a grown-up around politicians and say, listen, if they can't sell it to people, then they're not in a job and they can't do it anyway. So their problem is my problem. So things like side road zebra crossings, where they use all over the world and we're not allowed to do it. I don't really want to get into that too much now, but it's one of the simple tools that we can use to help kids be able to walk to school. Because of those 200 million 1 kilometre car journeys that we have every year, a lot of that's the school run. So they can visualise that. If I put a crossing on every side road on the way from your child's house to the school, would you let them walk to school? Yeah. And it changes things from, no, it's too dangerous, I'll run you there, to, well, go on then, but make sure you wait till the cars stop. So then I tell them, okay, well, to do that, provided we can get DFT to let us do it, which is another topic, I can put those in, instead of using raised pavements as they have in London, because it's the only way available. It costs between £30,000 and £50,000 for each junction. We could do this with we could do this with paint, and it costs us 300 quid, and we can do an entire estate in a week. And I can see a politician thinking, that helps. I can see it solves a problem, and I can sell it, and nobody objects to crossings. And so I think that's really important to address. The person who you need to change, what's their problem? What's in their way to stop them? And how can you answer that? Not what they should be doing or what I think they should be doing. And just to link that up to the previous little discussion, I totally agree. All of that stuff needs to be addressed. But if we talk to people about that all at once, I've just stopped listening. I'm just panicking now. It's too much for me. So the question for me then starts is, how do we start them on that journey? How do we take them to a place when they're ready to very quickly take the next step? Give me a nice bike path. This is great. Give me an e-bike that's been subsidized. Oh, this is great fun. Okay, now I know I can ride further. So it's almost giving the people something to try it for themselves, like quiet roads that we've had for the last 2 months. And if you believe in the product, people will want to do it as well. So I think how you frame the message is absolutely everything.
Shirley, was there anything you wanted to add from your perspective?
Yeah, you know, I agree with a lot of what Chris is saying. You know, from our point of view, it is about making it easy, and you know, we do have an opportunity. I know the word is a bit weird because you know it's like silver linings, but using this as an opportunity to show people what can be done and what is possible, and that it's safe to do, and others are doing it. People who've never been on a bike or haven't been on a bike since whenever are getting out there, and their friends and so on. So, and then with the sort of temporary measures, it's showing them what it could look like and experimenting, and I think that's really important. And then obviously getting ultimately it's about fiscal measures too, you know, incentives, what can help you. So I talked about scrappage schemes, but you know, sort of we've got the sort of bike schemes that, you know, through the taxation system, or as we've done in London, introduce charging systems and schemes which do work. You know, we've got differential parking charges, lots of different sort of ways of sort of locking in that behaviour change. But the biggest thing of all is seeing other people do it and feeling confident to do it themselves. And I think that's why we've got to use this as this opportunity to experiment, because once people do that and feel it's okay, not all of the trips are going to be done on a bike or by walking, and not all of them can be done. You know, I completely appreciate what Jillian is saying about leisure trips and alternatives and so on, but you know, I agree with Chris. You know, we go with what we can do, and there's an opportunity now to deal with those trips that we knew were difficult anyway, so let's deal with those now, whilst we're also tackling those bigger, longer term trips around, you know, the sort of alternatives to aviation.
And Jillian?
Yeah, I again agree with all of that. I mean, the only way that behaviour is going to change is if there's an attractive product for them to take up. I agree with that. But going back to my previous point, so we can lock in some of those really beneficial changes, but that doesn't prevent some really negative things happening by the same people, frankly, at the same time, but certainly in the aggregate, for the sort of bads to also increase. So the locking in idea, this is where we go back to the fact that there are fundamental things that we require to get us a holistic, sustainable transport system that we've known about for decades, that haven't, you know, sort of been lightened us just in the last couple of months. And these come down to things like the integration of the planning system and the transport system, levelling up the prices that people pay for each mode of transport, and that will include some kind of road pricing of some kind, and a completely different way in which we appraise the investments that we put into the transport system to value the right things. I mean, these are all fundamental building blocks that we cannot get away from, regardless of the fact that we may have a little bit more tendency for people to realise that they want to live in nicer places because they've had a taste of it over the last couple of months.
Can I just add to that I think this is the way to get that, because the first thing we want to do is you get people to get out the car and like it, and then they explore what more we can do with it. And that can be things like staying local for eating and for shopping, because I like going around by my bike, and I might give up my car because it's costing more. I totally agree with all the charging things. I mean, there's things about add 2 pence to the price of fuel, or rather just don't drop the price when oil gets cheaper. Nobody notices, and there you've got a fund to do a lot of this stuff. But it's making it easy. When Shirley said make it easy, if this isn't my easiest, and I'm not interested in the planet or anything else, if this isn't the easiest option for me, why would I change? So it has to be the easiest option. And right now we can make it the easiest option. And some of the levers that we can use to do that are our key workforce. A third of households in Greater Manchester don't have a car. It's about a quarter, I think, in the whole country, higher in London, but it's a third where I am. Now, those people rely on public transport to get to work. Only 10% of them can do that now. If I don't provide another way for them to get to work, then I'm saying they're going to put us all at risk by overcrowding transport, or they can't go to work. So that's the button, or that's the case I actually want to put right now. I can see all the other benefits from giving them a cycling option to do that 3 to 5 mile journey. 80% of the journeys where I am are less than 5 miles. And so I can see how it all fits together. I completely agree with Jillian. I think all those things are needed. And I can see this as part of the pathway to get there. And e-bikes, absolutely. I mean, some of the studies, one from France shows that 30% of the people who bought an e-bike, would not have bought any other kind of bike. And that's a game changer. And they also showed that regional grants and time-limited grants were really good to get that change as well. Yeah. So you can have £500 off, but only for the next 2 months and only for the first 500 people. Those things were really good at changing behaviour. And now is the time when you have a transport crisis, is the time to start dropping those things in with protected emergency space on a temporary base, and it all starts to fit together. And then you can start to have the bigger conversation on top of it.
I completely agree. And I think the point that we talk about green recovery, I think it's, that this is why I'm on this call and we're talking to a lot of people, organisations like Green Alliance and others, because, we are looking at this sort of transition period out of the sort of pandemic, however long that is, but we're looking at recovery and making sure that those green principles, these issues about integration of transport and planning, how do we properly integrate the sort of environmental costs into assessments, looking at alternatives to aviation, and so on, are really important as we start to look to helping the economy recover and the sort of consequences around bailouts and funding packages. So I think, that's really what we should be pushing. And we can see that around the world. Lots of organisations, mayors, the EU are talking about these sort of green recovery principles. And I think that's what's going to get us, as Chris said, this is a pathway, and we need to do something now to stop people reverting to the car, but that bigger prize is really necessary.
Great. Maybe we're not as far apart as we sounded briefly. I think it to do with kind of metrics and timescales and messaging, isn't it? Emma, have you got another question for us? I'm conscious that we've slightly we took longer on that one, but I thought it was a really interesting discussion. Thanks from everyone.
Yeah, no, thanks. There's been a lot of questions around inequality. So inequality to access for transport, if you rural versus urban areas, and various things like that. So how can an effective sustainable transport strategy help tackle inequality issues in transport?
Not a small question. Shall we start? We'll go around the same order. Can we try and keep answers brief, just because I want to see if we can fit in a final statement for everyone as well.
I can't remember what the order was.
Oh, sorry, Chris, you go first, and then Shirley and Jillian.
I think there's a lot. The challenges really are, you have to be prepared to make a loss. So if you want to serve a non-urban area out in the country, and you want people to not use cars for everything, then you have to subsidise that, and that has to be part of the system. And I'll add an extra point here. The 5 commissioners, Will Norman included, got together a few months ago and asked the Secretary of State for Transport for 5 things that would, within his gift, that would radically speed up what we're doing. And just to touch on one of them, one was BCR, benefit cost ratio, and how we value transport, and we do it on journey time. And all the health stuff and that's over there. I'm not calculating that. So we measure the time saved, and we don't measure the cost of making it easier to drive a car. And the classic example that was used at the time was Blackcap roundabout, just out, well, it's actually an interchange, a bit unfair to call it a roundabout, £1.5 billion to make journey times in a car 8 minutes quicker, and no calculation for what the cost of doing that by making journey times quicker and easier. And I think if we changed how we calculate BCR and factored in the downsides, because we know that every man, woman and child in the UK is paying £800 towards driving, whether they own a car or not. That's the cost of us of motoring. Then you start to look at your investment in a much different way, and active travel becomes much more viable as well. And then you can start to do things like look at what's the cost of subsidising a bus service What's that in terms of environment and health, etc. And you're factoring all of those things in, and suddenly you realise your overall spend, your net spend, you're getting a better return for your money. But while we split it up into departments, then I think while we silo it, we're going to keep making mistakes.
Thanks. Shirley?
Not really much more to add than Chris has said and what I said earlier. You know, I think first of all you need to know what the issues are, and you know, as I pointed out, we've done quite a lot of research in London to understand that sort of inequalities, and then you've got to design the network. But largely, ultimately, it's about understanding that this will need grant or subsidy to support people, because certainly, as you're seeing in London, you know, the relying just on commuters to sustain the whole network and provide subsidies for others isn't possible when something like this happens.
Great, thanks. Jillian?
Well, I think, again, it is a huge question, but one of the ways I think I'll answer it is to say, or to repeat the point that we really do need to do the analysis, because where people who are impacted negatively by certain policies, or by the fact that, you know, the bus use might demise, or the cost of something is going up, they're often not necessarily the people that we might first assume, or in the places that we might first assume. And so, and these are really locally specific issues as to where the people who may need to be taken care of the most might live, and their circumstances. So I'll bang the e-bikes drum again. My colleague Ian Phillips published some work last week through CREDS, the Centre for Research on Energy Demand Solutions, about the fact that when you do the analysis with e-bikes, so the analysis being you take local areas, LSOA units of areas, and what we know about who lives there, their fitness levels, age demographics, fitness levels, topography, current access to transport, types of journeys done there, car ownership. So you put all this sophisticated modelling at the local level, and the sorts of journeys that are made. And the places where e-bikes can get the most bang for your buck in terms of carbon reduction, and in terms of helping people who have, or in what we call transport poverty, are in rural areas and small towns. And where are we putting the shared e-bike systems? If we are having them, which there aren't very many, we're putting them in the centre of huge great cities, which is where we need them the least. So it's that kind of perverse thinking that we need to change. And it's going to sound like I'm being an academic and saying more research required, and that really is not the way this is meant to sound. It's just meant to say, you know, local intelligence and really thinking about where to target.
Great, thanks to you all for that. I'm afraid we've crashed through our question time with just two questions, so apologies for that. But I think those discussions were really fascinating, and we could have gone on much longer. I want to allow each of the panellists just a minute at the end to sort of pull up any themes that you didn't think we've covered so far. Shirley, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you, Roz, and to fellow panellists. It's been a really interesting discussion, and it really sort of characterises all the things that we're grappling with. But I think just to repeat, really, we have to do what we can do with the opportunities we have now, because that's a problem that existed before the pandemic, and we had to do something about it. So let's grab that opportunity. But we're not forgetting the longer term approach. And again, the green recovery approach that we're trying to engender here in London and across the UK is an opportunity to integrate that transport and planning and the inequalities agenda and the just transition and so on. So I think we have a huge opportunity. You know, government has to play its part, business has to play its part, and we all do as well.
Great, thanks. Chris, do you want to go next?
Yeah, the only thing I think that's, I've just noticed there's quite a few questions on how do we get councils to change, because people are still very much in that space. And I think just to touch back on what language do they speak? So at the start of the crisis, people were going, don't do anything different. Don't even speak to me about anything different. I'm panicking. I've lost masses of revenue. And then one or two councils started to do things, and other cities in the world started to do things. And then everybody very quickly went, we're not doing anything. It's just getting quite uncomfortable. And then as soon as a few places in the UK started doing something, it was quick, we need to change, do something. And that fear of missing out is a thing. And that's why we work, we're tribal. So I think there's a couple of things speaking to that is highlighting what other people are doing. Shouldn't we be doing that? Very much talk about the ones who will be left behind if you don't make provision for them. So you just park the bits that matter to us about health, about the environment. Just say, listen, you've got a big chunk of society here, at least a quarter of it, that doesn't have a car. So if they can't use public transport and they don't have a car, if you don't make other provisions for them, you're denying them work. And that's quite powerful for a local council. And then give them a solution that they can do, or at least is palatable. Or what about if we put a corridor in here that could get people that 5-mile journey, and look, you can take it out afterwards, so you take away the fear. So that how you talk to the things that are important to them. And there's very much a fear and greed element to all of us. And look what everyone else is doing, you're going to miss out. And look at that, that's a threat over there if you don't act for those people. So think about who you're talking to and what pushes their buttons. And I think active travel has shown just how robust it is in a crisis right now. And now is the time to give it a go.
Thank you. Gillian, any final thoughts from you?
Yes, and I'll try and be positive to finish. Because despite everything I've said, I do think that some tremendous opportunities have arisen. Again, opportunity out of a crisis, which is unfortunate, but you know, we are seeing some real food for thought across the board, from policymakers to individuals, etc., as a result of what's happened. And if we can't be bold now, then you know, when can we be? But I think the but in that is that we need to be bold, and we mustn't lose sight of the scale of the ambition that we were talking about just at the beginning of this year, when it was all about climate emergency, and just how much we had to do and how much investment we needed to put into the transport system. And we need to take all this opportunity together with that ambition, because it really does require a huge amount of it.
Great, thank you. It feels, yeah, on many levels, including transport policy, as if we're at a really critical time, and hopefully history will look back and judge the way people have reacted positively. But yeah, it's certainly I think going to be a turning point, and I'm sure the audience will agree there's been plenty of food for thought as well, from scary comparisons to 15-minute cities. Lots of really exciting, interesting stuff. So thanks to all of you. Before we wrap up with a virtual round of applause, I just wanted to say that there's a recording of this will appear on YouTube, and also we'll probably aim to put up a podcast as well. Our podcast can all be found on Green Alliance podcast.simplecast.com, and there's some really good ones on there, so go and check it out if you haven't already. But now I'd like everyone to thank our wonderful panelists. Thank you, and wish everybody a good evening as well. So if you could somehow join me in a round of virtual applause, that'd be great.